Hi everybody, how are you? I hope you are all right. We are going to continue with our classes about Culture 2, and this is the end of Unit number 1 with the Congress of Vienna that took place from November 1814 to June 1815. It was a meeting arranged for the benefit of the dominant classes and the countries that had defeated Napoleon. But let's start. The Congress of Vienna had its legacy. Unfortunately, the legacy it brought about was a legacy full of wars, as you will study in the future. And one of the main objectives was to remap Europe for the benefit, as I told you, of the countries that had defeated Napoleon in order to extend their territories and to be more powerful. What is the background of this Congress of Vienna? Well, after the defeat of Napoleon, the countries did not know what to do, that is to say, which territories belong to which countries, and there was a kind of chaos. So a Congress, a meeting was needed. But unfortunately, this meeting was just for the benefit of the countries that had defeated Napoleon. As you can see in the picture, there are a lot of delegates, but they did not take part in the important decisions that were taken by a bunch of leaders. After the overthrow of Napoleon, an overwhelming feeling for peace enfolded the minds of the conservative classes in the countries that had defeated Napoleon. There was an intention to come back to the status quo of 1789. And remember that before 1789, that is to say before the French Revolution, in France, for example, there was an absolute monarchy. So some conservative classes, that is to say the nobility, wanted to come back to that status quo, but they soon realized that was not possible. They wanted to revive the power and flamboyance of the absolute monarchy. However, the statesmen of the different countries involved in this Congress of Vienna realized that a complete return to the old regime was absolutely impossible. The French, for example, would not tolerate the coming back of revival of privileges. That is to say, they would not put up with the fact of a revival of serfdom, for example, or the return of the confiscated lands to the nobles and the church, because those lands had already been occupied and taken by the peasants. As I told you before, there were reasons for the Congress. Yes, there were. There was a necessity of this Congress, at least a meeting to rearrange Europe. One of the main objectives was to restore the old monarchies. For example, Louis XVIII was restored as the King of France, but, as I told you before, it was agreed that he had to rule in a limited monarchy because absolute monarchy was not possible. It was evident that rulers realized they would not be able to be despots or dictators as they were before the revolution. However, it was a biased message, because the victorious powers, that is to say Russia, for example, or Great Britain, were not ready to resign the conquests they had made at the expense of France and Napoleon. That is why a Congress was needed in order to remap Europe. What I mean that the countries that had gained territories with Napoleon did not want to resign to those territories. That is why it was important to remap Europe. But I repeat one more time, decisions were taken just by the most important and influential men in the Congress. Which were the characteristics of the Congress? Well, in this picture there are fewer people, because it was a meeting organized to decide the fate of Europe at the end of the long war against Napoleon. But in fact, it should not be called a Congress because it did not hold plenary sessions, since only a few influential and powerful leaders dominated the scene. The vital decisions were taken by small committees. 6 monarchs attended the Congress. Only 6 monarchs and some influential leaders. For example, the most influential leaders, as you can see, Alexander I, the Tsar of Russia, and Clemens von Metternich, the prince heir of the throne of Austria. Remember these ones because they were very important. But there were other important influential men. We have these two. One is the Duke of Wellington. The Duke of Wellington, his name was Arthur Wellesley, but he was the Duke of Wellington. Everybody knew him by his title and not by his name. He represented Great Britain. And Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, he represented, as you know, France. Well, the Duke of Wellington was very, very powerful. He was considered a very important man for the history of Great Britain. But Talleyrand was considered a two-faced man, since he had served as a bishop in times of Louis XVI and as a foreign minister for Napoleon. And now he was representing France in the Congress. But the dominant roles of the Congress were played by the men we saw in the previous slide. Alexander I from Russia and Clemens von Metternich, the Prince of Austria. These were the leaders of the Congress, Alexander I and Clemens von Metternich. Well, let's deal with the ideals of the Congress. There was a map after the Congress of Vienna. We will see it later with the new countries and the countries that were eliminated. But the main ideals that guided the Congress were the principle of legitimacy and the system of compensation. What was the principle of legitimacy? It meant that the dynasties of Europe that had been on the throne before the revolution, that is to say, before the French Revolution, should be put back as monarchs. And then each country should regain the same territories they had held in 1780 until 1789. So, this was very important to take into account because obviously there were changes in Europe. So, the principle of legitimacy and the system of compensation. For example, following this principle, Louis XVIII was recognized as the legitimate sovereign of France, and the House of Orange was restored in the Netherlands, also the House of Bourbon in Spain, and the two Sicilies. France was allowed to keep her boundaries, but was compelled to pay an indemnity of 700 billion francs, a lot of money. The Pope was allowed to recover his possession in Italy. The Polish kingdom, created by Napoleon, remember that I told you that the only national anthem in the world that makes reference to Napoleon is the Polish national anthem. Well, that kingdom created by Napoleon was abolished, and it was divided mainly among Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The principle of legitimacy had the main objective, which was the system of compensation. So the system of compensation is as a consequence of the principle of legitimacy. It was the main purpose that the great powers had in order to keep the territories. Obviously, it was to gratify their hunger for territories. So, for example, let's analyze this chart. It was the system of compensation. For example, Great Britain was compensated because of the role she took in defeating Napoleon with South Africa, Guyana in South America, and Sri Lanka, and the island of Ceylon. These territories belong to Netherlands. So all of the sudden, these people went to the control of Great Britain, and Netherlands lost those territories. But the Netherlands were compensated with Belgium. Belgium belonged to Austria. So all the people that belong to Austria now belong to the Netherlands. And Austria, because of having lost Belgium, was compensated with the independent city-states of Venice and Milan, and she had the chance to put on the throne people of the Habsburg dynasty in Tuscany and Parma. So Russia, because she took a very important role in defeating Napoleon, was allowed to retain Finland, which used to belong to Sweden. Sweden was given Norway, which used to belong to Denmark. So they delivered, that is to say, these territories as slices of bread or pieces of a pizza, because they did not take into account culture, religion, anything. People which belong to who belong to the Netherlands now belong to Great Britain, or people who were Swedish now were Russians. So this was a real mess. But why did they do this? In order to satisfy their hunger for new territories. And this is a map of Europe after the Congress of Vienna in 1815. As you can see, well, you have Africa with no changes in the northern part, Spain and Portugal. As you can see, there is no Italy. You have independent states, Tuscany, Papal States, the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, Milan, Venice. Also, there is no Germany. You have some important kingdoms of Hanover, Prussia, Bavaria. We will study the unification of Italy and Germany in the following classes. You got France, United Netherlands, because now it was Netherlands and Belgium all together. Poland disappeared. Poland was given to Russia, and there was a Congress Poland which belonged to Sweden and some part to Austria and also Prussia. And well, you got Denmark. As you can see, the Russian Empire was allowed to retain Finland, and this was a real mess. Really, it was complicated for the people to know which countries they belonged to and which rules they had to respect and whose government they belonged to. So, the remapping of Europe. It was a huge mistake. Why was it a huge mistake? It was a huge mistake because all these arrangements were put through with a total disregard for the interests of the peoples concerned. Despite the fact that the Belgians were altogether different in culture and religion from the Dutch, they were nevertheless forced to submit to the rules of Holland. So there was a total disregard of cultures. Nor were the interests of the Norwegians, for example, considered in the slightest in transferring them to the sovereignty of Sweden. As in the case of the Congress of Vienna, there was a repetition of these mistakes in the Treaty of Versailles that we are going to study after World War I. So, the Congress of Vienna, remember, it is a significant long-term cause for World War I. So when we study World War I, we are going to come back to the Congress of Vienna, which was organized and held, remember, for the benefit of the most dominant countries and the most influential leaders in order to remap Europe for their own benefit. Well, that's all for this class. This is the end. Remember, Napoleon started with the coup d'etat of 1789 and finished with the Congress of Vienna. Obviously, Napoleon had already been defeated, but the settlements for the rearrangement of Europe after Napoleon were organized in this Congress of Vienna. Thanks a lot. See you in our next class.